European countries and how they perceive China and Chinese engagement.
3 minutes, right? This feels like a sports show. I was ready for a kind of a stock market breakdown and wish this was a coffee. Very quickly, and some signpostings that I look forward to discuss later on with the panel. I mean, first of all, and this is kind of a preview of an upcoming book of mine with Melbourne University Press. First of all, what we're seeing is a kind of a 50 shades of hedging and agency as far as Southeast Asia is concerned. I think yesterday there was a lot of discussion about agency and strategic autonomy, etc. But clearly it's a spectral thing. You know, when you talk about countries like Laos, for instance, their situation is tremendously different from a country like the Philippines, for instance. And Singapore, we had our good friend Bilahari also there. You know, they have also their own kind of degree of strategic agency and hedging. Now, speaking of hedging, of course, you know, I have my own ideas about this. We can discuss this later on. I believe there's also some limitation to how much hedging you can do, or what I call strategic polyamory, right? At some point, countries will have to make choices, because not making a choice is a choice in itself, and it has costs. And sometimes it's a privilege that some countries cannot afford. So I come from a country called the Philippines. We're very close to Taiwan. We're a U.S. treaty ally. We cannot be neutral on issues like Taiwan, for instance, right? And what's happening there. So we're adjusting accordingly. And also what you see in the region is wild swings, not only among countries, but within countries. I mean, I used to be here almost every month back in the day when Duterte was the president, Trump was the president. I had one book on each of them. Now things are very, very different. And ironically, under Marcos Jr., which we all feared will be the next big dictator, but things have turned out very well, interestingly, in the right direction. But then again, you cannot say for sure what's going to happen to a country like the Philippines in the next coming years, or after Marcos Jr. steps down from office in 2028. So there's a lot of what I call strategic indeterminacy, right? That's why it's a very fluid picture. And speaking of fluidity, this will be my last point because I think my 3 minutes is almost over. I don't think the region is really bipolar. I find it intellectually impoverished when I say it's a US-China competition. If you look at the infrastructure development landscape, China has been engaging in what I call pledge trap, not debt trap. A lot of pledges, and they get a lot of PR bang out of their imaginary buck. I mean, they're really good capitalists as far as PR is concerned. In the Philippines, I mean, they offered $24 billion in investments to Duterte. I'm still watching for 100 million to come in. It's already 2024, last time I checked. And, you know, when Marcos went back there last year, they just repackaged the same thing minus the few millions that got in, right? Put a little bit of renewables here and there. It's actually Japan, which leads the infrastructure development picture. The metro underground system in Manila is being developed by Japan. If you look at Vietnam, Philippines, a lot of key countries in the region, Japan trounces China by far, even in terms of just pledges. So even in pledges, China is not necessarily ahead. So we tend to forget Japan, because it's a stealth power in many ways. So I see the region more like, you know, my understanding of the region's geopolitics is like German politics. You have two dominant parties, SPD and CSU and CDU, but the third parties, the smaller parties, can determine the direction of the flow. And that's why India is important, Japan is important, South Korea is important, and European partners who are getting more engaged in this part of the world are important.
Thank you. Okay, let's turn to the Pacific Island countries. Duveri, give us an overview. I mean, even within the Pacific, there's sort of three distinct subregions with very different relationships with China as well as other partners. Can you give us an overview of that region?
I think there has to be also sometimes honest conversations. Like, I know you guys, you don't want to make choices, you want to make the most out of this, but push comes to shove, right? Who do you think is really the threat to you in the region? Last time I checked, the U.S. doesn't have maritime territorial disputes with Vietnam, with the Philippines. My goodness, even the Indonesians have problems with China right now because their 9-dash line is going all the way to North Natuna Sea. So that reality has to be reminded that, you know, China may sound more understanding and all of that, but you have some fundamental territorial and maritime issues that you don't have with us Americans. You can talk about what happened 100 or 50 years ago and all of that. That's important because I think the Global South, now I want to go back to our title, the Global South discourse is weaponized by China consistently to push their own version. But believe me, their understanding of multipolarity is not the same as us in ASEAN. For us, multipolarity is more agency, more room for conversation, an inclusive, pluralistic international order. China's version of multipolarity is post-American, more Pax Sinica. So we have to be absolutely clear about that and push back against the weaponization of the post-colonial discourse. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we are over time, so we have China. I mean, certainly you mentioned infrastructure. You know, China's Belt and Road and other initiatives in Southeast Asia have delivered a tremendous amount of infrastructure. This has been very welcome by many governments. less delivery in the Philippines.
Yeah.
But how do these countries view, and what are the interesting differences among countries and how they view China's offers of infrastructure and other kinds of things, and then what are concrete ways that countries view other partners as alternatives?
Well, I mean, yesterday we had folks from Africa Barometer looking at very important data and numbers. I think in case of Southeast Asia, I mean, of course, we have the Pew surveys, Gallup, among others, but I suggest really folks to check the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies annual surveys of influential folks. I mean, they tend to ask the policymaker and thought leaders about their ideas about who are the most preferred partners, what are the pros and cons of that. I mean, consistently we see Japan and the European Union coming on top of others. I mean, there's strategic skepticism both towards China and the BRI, but also to a certain degree towards the United States. So if you look at the views of the US, it increased significantly when Biden came into power, but now things are tapering off a little bit. So I think we have a lot of data and number that shows that not only countries do not see it as purely bipolar, they actively want other players like Japan and the European Union to be involved here. Now, of course, as far as U.S. and its network of allies is concerned, then things can get more interesting, right? Because Japan can coordinate it with the United States, India sometimes can coordinate it with Japan and U.S. So in that sense, as much as China is very influential, I mean, I'm not being dismissive towards some of the big projects. I mean, they have very big profile projects, whether it's the high-speed railway project in Laos, whether it's the Bandung-Jakarta, finally finished in Indonesia. But, they get a lot of bang out of that buck, right? That limited but big-ticket projects. But you see, we want other countries to be involved here. And we see that, for instance, India now is becoming a very big player on the defense front. They're about to deploy the supersonic BrahMos missile system. Some of them have even Russian technological derivative there. But the Indians just sent a very big delegation to the Philippines. So they're looking at Vietnam, they're looking at Philippines, they're looking at a number of countries in the region where they can build a big defense market. Well, what's important here is the shot of the future, right? So if we were to have this conversation 3, 4, 5 years ago, the assumption was China is going to overtake the United States by this time. So that structured people's strategic moves and expectations. Now that the discourse is not that China is going to collapse, but China is not going to really, China is almost peaking, suddenly people are looking, okay, who are the other rising powers? And this is where India comes in. Or what are the other players that have not been as appreciated, even if they don't have that upward trajectory? Let's look at Europe, let's look at France, what they can offer, or South Koreans, who have been also very much on the upward trajectory. I mean, South Korea now is one of the largest exporter of defense equipment, and a number of countries in the Middle East, whether it's Turkey, among others. So what I'm saying here is that the strategic horizons of Southeast Asian countries have expanded, and they actively want that expansion. And if you look at the discussion in different capitals in the region, they don't sit down and say what US and China think. They're looking at how can we leverage our position while we're building our capabilities. But the last point on this, my sense is, I was in the ASEAN meetings and summits last year in Jakarta. My sense is, if you look at key countries like Indonesia, their understanding is time is on our side, actually, perhaps even more than China, because demographically we're in a good position. So since last year, several ASEAN countries are growing faster than China, Philippines, Vietnam. Their idea is, give us 10, 20, 30 years, we're all going to be full-fledged middle power at the very least. And Indonesia may even vie for something bigger. So let's play it safe. Let's not do something crazy. Let's build our capacity, get everything from other side. And in 20 years, we're going to have interesting conversations with these big guys, because we're going to be quite big ourselves. So clearly that applies to Indonesia. Clearly that applies to Vietnam. And hopefully Philippines down the road. And it's very interesting that Indonesia snubbed the BRICS because it wants to join the club of OECD. So when a country as vital as Indonesia, third largest democracy, largest Muslim majority country, says, no, I want to be in the club of OECD countries, that tells you about what deep inside they're thinking about. There are all of this conversation of anti-Western conversation, global South conversation, but a lot of us actually, we want to be part of OECD if you look at the key rising countries in that part of the world. So that's where I think there's a lot of room for the West to come in and build constructive, good, forward-looking relationship. There is chip on our shoulders, because whether it's Philippines and Indonesia, we had certain interaction in the past, to put it mildly, which were not optimal. But it's not like the Chinese are doing a good job too, right? By elbowing their way through. So I think now the field is open, it's exciting, it's fluid, and that's why I find Southeast Asia quite an interesting part of the world. I used to, write a lot about the Middle East and other parts of the world. I was bored with ASEAN, but nowadays, I think this is the sexiest part of the world as far as geopolitical dynamism is concerned. Yeah.
Very optimistic. Well, both of you, I think, have painted a picture that's an important theme to